another great name, because this man has been in the video games industry since 1996, and he was involved in such names as Baldur's Game 1 and 2, we all know it, Neverwinter Nights, Star Wars The Old Republic, and of course, the Dragon Age. And lately he has been game director for Star Wars The Old Republic. Let's put your hands together for Mr. James Ohlen. Welcome.
All right, so I assume everyone can hear me? Yes, I think so. So I'm going to be talking about working on large game teams. I think working in the video game industry has changed a lot over the last 20 years as the industry has produced fewer and fewer games with larger and larger teams. And I think it's good for people trying to get into the industry to know what they're getting into. So I've given this presentation before, and I thought it would be a good one to give here as well. He's already given the introductions. These are the games that I've worked on. And currently, my role is Director of Design for Bioware, which means I do a lot of the talent hunting and hiring and working with the creative directors on our different franchises. So, in some ways, the reality of working in the games industry doesn't match the dream that you have when you're thinking of getting into the games industry as a kid. You're playing your favorite video games, and you dream about getting onto a game team in the future. And the way you think of it or dream about it is probably you being the vision holder, the creative director, the lead designer, the person calling the final shots. And in fact, when you get into some of the education in the universities, especially in North America, you're put in situations where you're working with very small teams of 3 or 4 people. And in those small teams, you get a great deal of autonomy. You feel a lot of ownership. And you learn a lot of good skills. But it doesn't really match what you get into when you get into the games industry. Now, a majority of the jobs in the games industry for designers are at the big publishers such as Electronic Arts, Activision, Ubisoft. And these kind of publishers are, as I said before, building fewer and fewer games. And those games have bigger and bigger budgets, and they have teams that are hundreds or even thousands of people in size. And being a designer on one of those teams, you're often working with 40 to upwards of 100 plus other designers, which means that getting that creative director role, the vision holding role, is a very rare thing. And so you have to work within the industry that you get into, which is not to say that that's a bad thing. I don't want to be discouraging, because working as a designer in the industry is an amazing thing. It's probably one of the most fulfilling jobs that you can have. You get to create worlds and experiences out of nothing. You get to work with some of the most talented and brightest individuals in the world. And one of the things about being a designer, a good designer, is you're a problem solver. You're probably solving problems every day. Difficult problems, but exciting problems. And finally, the content you're producing, the stuff that you're building, it's going to be played by millions of people all across the world, often tens of millions of people. So for the purposes of this presentation, I'm going to be talking about the structure, how we divide, and how designers work within Bioware. So at Bioware, we have design teams that range anywhere from 30 to 50 designers on one of our games. And each of the designers fits into one of our 4 pillars, whether it's writing, level design, systems design, or gameplay design. And each of these categorizations is a way of categorizing a designer with the people he's going to be working with the stakeholders and the other departments that he's going to be working with, and the deliverables that he's going to be creating. So when you think of being a designer, at Bioware, a designer starts off by coming up with the design of what needs to be done, and that design creates a set of deliverables that's handed out to other departments, whether it's art, sound, programming. Those deliverables are created, and then the designers have to put them back together into the game. So before I go and describe each of the different designer types, I'm just going to talk about the expectations of a designer at Bioware. This is actually, so at Bioware we categorize designers by levels. It's something that is done throughout EA, Electronic Arts. And our levels range from level 17, I guess. You got to skip those first 16 levels when you joined Bioware. You start off as a 17th level character who can cast 9th level spells already. That was a Dungeons and Dragons joke. Anyways, you start off at level 17, and the expectations, the responsibility and expectations of a designer at that level are obviously significantly different than a level 22 creative director. When you're first getting in, our expectations are we want you to be a great listener and learner, and essentially, we know you're going to make a lot of mistakes, but we want you to take the time to essentially grow to the next level, which is level 18, where we expect that you're actually going to be producing content that's going to make it into the final game. Of course, at that low of experience level, you're going to be needing a lot of oversight and guidance and mentorship. And it goes all the way to level 22, which is the creative director, whereupon you now are owning the vision of either a product or a segment of a product. Again, as games get bigger and there are fewer of them, we now have games where there are more than one level 22 designer, creative director on a product because the size and scope of the product requires that there be more. So writers. Bioware, due to the fact that we are known for creating games with a significant amount of story, the writing discipline is an important one for us. Now, writers at Bioware are responsible for, obviously, the story, the narrative, the characters, the dialogue, the context, the world building. And when you look at what a writer receives, the content input to a writer, it's the IP itself. Like, they need to know the IP inside and out, whether it's someone else's IP, like Star Wars, or whether it's an existing IP that was created at Bioware, like a Dragon Age, or if it's a new IP that the writers get to be involved in the creation of. They also have to, another content input is level design. What is the level structure going to be of the game? Is it going to be an open world game? Is it going to be a linear, level-based game? These are important questions that have to be answered so the writer knows what he's going to be producing. And what comes out of when a writer's doing his job, he's creating dialogue, in-game text. He's creating the world building, as in kind of the narrative story building of the world. These are the things that he's responsible for producing. So the level designer, and we have more level designers at Bioware than any other type of designer, is essentially responsible for building the levels or the world of the game. And that's a significant amount of work, obviously, considering the size of Bioware games. And in fact, if you look at the industry as a whole, as open world games become more and more in vogue, so almost every game's an open world game now, the size and scope of the worlds that need to be built are huge. So I don't see, level design is a good discipline to get into if you want to get into the games industry as it is. So a level designer, his inputs are obviously level art, the story, narrative design, creatures, gameplay, game systems, pretty well everything. Everything is given over to the level designer, and he needs to make sure that all of that comes together and creates a compelling experience, whether it's the critical path of the game or if it's the open world aspects of the game. So the other two designer types are systems designers and gameplay designers, which are related, but with some key differences. The way we divide them at Bioware is a systems designer is someone who's responsible for game systems that are more GUI-driven or statistics-driven, such as the level-up system or the inventory system. Those would be good examples. And so the inputs for a system designer is the GUI, the graphical user interface, programming, visual effects, audio. And what he produces are game progression systems, level-up systems, inventory systems, He also does a lot of balance for things such as the economy, the balance of combat, statistics of combat. And the last pillar of designers is the gameplay designer. And these are the designers who are working on more of the moment-to-moment systems, the systems which you are controlling second by second, such as the camera or combat or movement. And they're working with GUI programming, animation's a big one, VFX and audio. So what they output are powers, melee, shooting, camera, movement, control scheme. These are the things they're responsible for. So at Bioware, whenever we're looking at bringing on a designer, we want to make sure that they fit the culture of the studio. And the culture of the studio is built off of our values and kind of encapsulated by our mission statement, which is the greatest stories that you can play. Now, our values at Bioware are quality in the product and quality in the workplace. And that's something we've had for almost 2 decades now. It's a way of balancing the needs of the video game with the needs of the people building the video game, because they almost always compete. A video game needs to come out at a certain date at a certain quality, which means that crunch time is a lever that will be pulled. But if you're not worrying about quality in the workplace, you will pull that crunch time lever far too much, and your people will burn out, and they will leave, and you will lose valuable talent. So it's important to balance those two. The other thing, one of our key values is humility. So we have in context of humility with these 2 values. And what that means is, actually, before I go on to what I think that means in regards to working at Bioware, I do feel that humility is a key attribute, not just as a designer at Bioware, but as a creative in any industry. And when I talk about humility, I don't mean, it's not you lack confidence or you don't like putting yourself out there or you don't have drive. None of those things. What I like to say humility is that you recognize the following things: that there is always a better way to do something, that there are many answers to a problem, that your answer that you came up with is just a single answer. It's not the only answer, and it's probably not even the best answer. And one of the key things is the best answer may, and by may, most likely, will lie with someone else. And your job as a designer is not to make sure that your idea gets into the game. That's where so many designers go wrong. Your job as a designer is to make sure that the best idea goes into the game. And this is just kind of the opposite side of humility. These are things, and all of us, I am guilty of all of this stuff, as most people are, but these are self-destructive thoughts that can derail you as a designer. One is, your vision is better. You're working with someone else's vision because that's the way it usually is, and you just have a hard time believing in that other person's vision because you think that you just have all the answers. There's also I need to prove that I have the best answer, and I'm going to prove it to the team or my coworkers or my boss that I was right all along. The third one, which we like to nickname the Great Reveal, and the Great Reveal is always not a great thing because it's I don't want to show my work yet. I don't want to get that. People might be critical of it, so I'm just going to save it until I've got all the problems solved, and then I'm going to show my lead what I've done. And the fourth one is, I'm a designer, and so the other departments exist to serve me. So all these are obviously bad ways of thinking, and obviously they lead to some not so great things, such as not putting passion into your work, or when you're working to prove a point, you often ignore better options. So you need to prove you're right, and therefore a better option might be staring you in the face, but you ignore it. When you don't show off your work, that's a recipe for disaster because you're not getting the feedback you need, the critical feedback, in order to improve your work. And so the great or grand reveal is almost always a disaster. And when you don't collaborate with the other disciplines, when you consider designers to be the best, you disempower the artists and the programmers and everyone else, and that means that they can't put their passion into the work that you're doing, and you depend upon them for your success. So when you look at being a designer, I like to think of the designer having two major roles. The title designer kind of immediately makes you think of one kind of role, which is the architect role. You know, I'm a designer. I'm designing or architecting systems or levels. That's my job, to be creative, to have a vision. And that's true. That is one of the jobs of a designer. But the other job is to be an expert at translating someone else's vision. And this is very important to being successful. And if you ever want to get that creative director job, you have to become a master at being able to translate other people's visions. Mainly because even as a creative director, you are translating someone else's vision, unless you happen to be an entrepreneur who owns your company. And even then, you always have someone who's got something. So, yeah, you need to be an expert at translating visions in a way that is effective and achieves what the product owner you're working with wanted. So this can sometimes be difficult. Translating someone else's vision can be hard when you think that their vision sucks. I'm sure anybody who's worked in the industry has been in this position. So some of the things to do, advice that I give people or that I use myself, is to try to have empathy for the vision, also empathy for whoever's championing it, or to try to have try to understand who it's trying to appeal to, and just having respect for whoever's giving you this vision to translate. Another key attribute of being a successful designer is active listening. If you are not a good active listener, it's very difficult to understand what a product owner is telling you to do. You need to be able to listen and ask questions and get to the heart of what you're being asked to do. And one of the ways to find out if you're a good active listener is just to ask friends or coworkers and discover how good of an active listener am I. And if you have good friends, hopefully they'll tell you the truth. Sometimes it can be illuminating. And if you aren't a good active listener, it's definitely worth investing in improving in that skill. And you can improve. Being a good active listener is something that there are ways of doing it or improving how you listen that will help you in that regard. Another thing that's important in terms of buying into a vision is just playing games that represent that vision. If you are working for a studio with a library of games that they've already built, make sure that you have played all those games, that you understand those games, and that you just don't focus on what those games did wrong, because often designers like to do that. You also focus on what those games did right. You can also play games or watch movies or read books that are similar in nature to the game that you are building. And again, don't just focus on what they do wrong. Also look at all the things that they do right. Why did people love them and love these games or the genre in the first place? So the ideal. So this is something I like to bring up with my designers because in the video game industry, there is a lot of compromise. The video game industry has compromise all the time. You have a limited budget. You have a production timeline. You're going to have to be amazing at making the right compromises if you're going to be a good designer. But at the same time, you can't lose sight of what the ideal is. What are you aiming to achieve? And in order to do that, you need to first know what the ideal is. So you need to keep up to date with the industry, know what the industry's expectations are, what is the bar of what you're working on. You need to always be aiming at the ideal. And then you need to forgive yourself when you don't hit that ideal, because no one ever does. You get close to it, sometimes you get far from it, but you definitely need to be able to learn lessons and move on and to the next task that you have. But it's just always good to recognize what you're aiming for. Even when you miss it, that's okay. You'll do better next time. So when I look at modern games on the console, the AAA games, the big budget games, I think that the main thing that they're doing is fantasy fulfillment. It's a chance for people to live in an existing, or live in a fantasy world or a fantasy experience and be the hero of that experience, to escape normal life into something where they get to be fantastic. And that is true whether it's a fantasy role-playing game or whether it's a football sports game. And so in these kind of games, immersion and fantasy fulfillment are king. I like to bring up Star Trek: The Next Generation's holodeck as an example of the ultimate video game. Once we get the holodeck, all of us video game designers can retire. We want to get closer and closer to that. So some of that means, what does that mean in more specific terms? You never want to take the player out of his experience. You want to have as non-intrusive interface as you can have, as possible. This is something a lot of designers stumble over. While it's important that a player is able to control his character and have control, you don't want to be taking him out of his immersion by cluttering the screen with all sorts of GUI elements that don't help with his immersion. Failure is something you want to have in your game because it's important as a learning experience, but it's a good learning tool. But it's also you want to keep it fleeting. You don't want to have the punishments too harsh. You want to give the player agency. You want to give the player choices in the game, whether that's within the story or the build of his character or how he explores the level. And those choices need to matter. He has to be able to understand how those choices changed his game experience. But then again, you don't want so many choices that you paralyze the player. That's something that is an actual thing. And of course, you want to make the player extraordinary. You want to make them feel heroic because the whole purpose of him or her playing the game is to escape the mundane world. So this is one thing for inspiration. I like to say, steal from a place of love. So when you're being inspired, it's okay to steal. It's not okay to copy. So the best way I like to say, what's the difference between stealing and copying? I think it's when you love something or you understand it in great depth, it's much easier to be inspired by it because you can understand at a core level what makes it appealing. But if you don't love it, if you don't understand it, then you're more likely to copy because you don't understand at a deep level what makes it appealing. So if you're going to be inspired by something that you can love. So one of the key attributes that we look for in designers at Bioware is being solutions-oriented. And that's important, obviously, because video game development is difficult. Again, schedules, budgets, technology failing you. But that's okay, because being a problem solver is something that's one of the most exciting aspects of being a designer. Also, I strongly believe that constraints breed creativity. And the reason that it does is because human beings are set in their ways. We're creatures of habit. So once we learn how to do something, we will just do it that way over and over again. And the only way we will break out of that habit is if we can't do it that way. We have restrictions, and so we have to come up with a creative solution to the problem. And that can lead to some really exciting things. And my mantra is there is always a creative solution to every single problem. It's just that sometimes you can't find it. So it's sometimes you need to create something to a level at the level of quality that's needed, in the timeline that's needed, and you just can't find, you don't have enough time, so you have to get extra time. But there was probably a creative solution there that would have allowed you to do it in the existing time. So you should just always be looking for it. Now, and again, if you can't find that creative solution, you don't beat yourself up on it. But I think having the attitude that it is there and you just have to find it is a good one. Because then you're not, as a designer, you're not going to be successful if you keep on telling your boss, well, I can't do it to the level you need because the time I have is not enough. Sometimes that is the answer, but if it's the answer too often, then you're not going to be well loved. So elegant is a better word than simple. So this is because designers hate, I used to say, keep it simple. Stupid, well, I took out the stupid, but keep it simple, and designers hate the word simple. So now I like to use the word elegant. So designers are notorious for over-designing things. I think every designer, including myself, has over-designed systems. And it's something that you kind of have to break from. You have to understand the importance of elegance and simplicity to the game experience. And elegance to me means intuitive, non-intrusive, thematically appropriate, and rewarding. So all of those things need to be in place for the system or content that you're building to be working. And that can range from a story moment all the way to a progression system. Finally, I just have this little graphic that I got off of the internet on constantly improving. And that's just something that it comes to the humility aspect and having an idea, always aiming for the ideal and learning lessons and applying them to the next time you do something. And it's just, you plan something, you do it, then you get it reviewed, and you figure out what went wrong, what went right, and then you make adjustments. So the next time you're working on something, you've learned and you are doing better. Anyways, not quite it. Summary, important things for being a designer at Bioware: humility, translating a vision, fantasy fulfillment, dealing with love, problem solving, elegance, improvement loop. And that's it. Just questions. Are we doing questions? All right, we are doing questions.
If you have any questions, just raise your hands. Yep, thank you.
Hello, great talk. I wanted to ask you, how do you manage to stay involved with other departments? Because Bioware is a big company, and from my experience, the best way to express the vision, even if it's someone else's. For example, if I go with a vision to the artist, then the best way to talk about this is with images. So I learned a little Photoshop to better express how what the idea is, and then we can talk about it. For the programmers, the algorithm would be better to discuss than images, for example. Do you involve these interdisciplinary roles of some kinds, or rather you designers have their own work and the coders have their own work and you don't mingle with each other?
Oh no, I think every team now makes use of interdisciplinary pods where you're working on a piece of the game, and say it's a level, then you want the level designer working with the level artist, working with the writer, working with whoever else is involved, the sound guys. I think how you interact with the other disciplines often differs according to what stage of the product you are in, whether you're in pre-production versus production versus finaling. As you pointed out, the type of developer that you're working with. As a designer, you don't want to get married to your favorite way of communicating design vision. You actually want to have the ability to communicate design vision in multiple ways, because you're going to have to vary that style according to who you're interacting with. Because at the end of the day, if you can't communicate it properly, you won't get back what you want.
Thanks.
So again, great talk. I have a question going back to the slide about designer levels at BioWare. How is the work, just general design work, spread across these levels? Can you go more into detail about how these levels cooperate with each other?
Well, I think, you see, the levels, there's a difference between your role and the level that you have. So, you know, when we have roles in a project, there'll be the creative director, there'll be like the lead systems designer, the lead combat designer, the lead level designer. Then you'll have level designers underneath. And within each of those roles, you'll have different levels. For example, you might have a team of 15 level designers, of which a few were just hired at 17, some are 18, some are 19, some are 20, and the lead level designer is 21. And it could be that you might divide up the responsibility of the levels, as in the lead level designer will say, hey, these are the key levels of the game that are going to be the most complex and the most player-facing, perhaps the first few hours or the last part of the game. So therefore, I'm going to give it to my most experienced, highest level designer. Well, you know, these are some of the more entry-level designers, and so we're going to give them levels that, or areas of the world that are simpler and allow them to learn. And that's how we kind of use the leveling system.
Okay, thank you.
More questions?
I wanted to ask about the levels again. How do you determine the levels? Is it just skill-based? Are there some rigorous levels, skills that one has to acquire to gain a certain level?
So I think they are not just skill, well, I guess it depends on what you define as skills. It's not just the technical skills of designing, it's also the communication skills, the interpersonal skills, all those things need to be at a certain level before you get a promotion in that regard. Now, we don't have a strict test or anything like that that determines that, because the video game industry is always changing, so how you measure a designer's ability is always changing also. You really need to depend upon the manager of that designer's opinion on how the designer's doing, like what is the level of work that that designer is producing. My job as director of design is to take a look across all three of the studios and just make sure that how managers are assessing the quality of a designer is relatively similar to other managers across Bioware.
Thanks.
Hello. I have a question about organization, because you just mentioned before that you organize your teams in across interdisciplinary pods working on parts of the game, and at the same time you say that there's say 15, 20 level designers on a project. And how is the communication and the process being managed between the cross-disciplinary teams and their goals, and at the same time knowledge sharing, as I imagine, and the oversight over specifically level designers, system designers, and gameplay designers, etc.?
I think so. The way, I guess, at Bioware we have a matrix system where we have production on one line, and then we have discipline on another line. This is not just for design, but for art and programming and everything else. And production is really responsible for the deliverables, the timeline, the budget, and is it achieving whatever deliverable it is it achieving its goals, while the discipline leads are responsible for quality and mentoring and skills, and for making sure that the tools, that their people have all the right tools. So it's kind of a shared responsibility there, but you do have different things that you're looking at depending upon which access you're on.
Because the production roles are responsible for the schedule, basically, right, and the output, and the leads are responsible for quality, and they work together to manage the project, I guess. Yes? Yeah,
it's not quite that well defined, because producers also have to be responsible for quality in a way. Like they can't. Quality is kind of a shared responsibility. Plus, quality is often a result of designers and artists and programmers in a pod all working together well. So it is, and often, much like one of the things I like to say is that titles are just titles, and you really, what a person's responsible for is what he's really good at doing, him or her is good at doing. So it's, if they are great at assessing quality, then, for example, say you have a producer who's great at assessing quality, then more of that can be put on to their shoulders. But if you have a producer whose skills lie elsewhere and the quality aspect not very good at assessing quality, then you put it more on the discipline leads.
Okay, thanks.
Hello. How do you seek balance between communicating and between documentation and discussion? Because at the beginning of our company, we started to produce documentation for programmers so that they can, implement. Then they lacked detail, so we added detail. Then the documentation bloated, so we added like short overview snippets. But the snippets didn't really explain much because they were, short. So we organized sometimes meetings to, to sell the idea. So now we have meetings sometimes, overviews, and bloated detailed documentation, and kind of going nowhere.
So after 20 years, we've never solved that problem. It's like it is. I don't know. There's a simple rule I like to have is design documentation is very important to get the ball rolling, because often what happens is you have the paralysis of like, no one's making a decision. We don't know what we're supposed to be working towards. So you create a document, and then everyone's like, oh, okay, now we're working towards something. And then a day later, it's going to be out of date because people are going to, as they work on it, realize they can't do certain things or that certain things will work better. So I think saying to yourself, I need to do documentation to get the ball rolling, but I also have to understand that that documentation needs to evolve and is going to be out of date almost immediately. Helps you at least deal with that issue, though how often you update your documentation and where you put your documentation at. Like there's a whole bunch of different, you could have, an internal wiki page, or you could communicate in Word documents, or you could communicate in PowerPoints, or you could, there's so many different ways to communicate, and often it depends upon the team that you're working with or the people you're working with, and there's never, there is no perfect solution to it, so.
Hi, could you please elaborate more about the difference between a system designer and a gameplay designer, especially why do you need that distinction in your process?
So the reason we broke up system designers and gameplay designers is because their skills are so different. So a great gameplay designer is most likely not going to be a great system designer, and a great system designer is most likely not going to be a great gameplay designer. In fact, I can't think of a designer who is great at either of them, because if you're a great gameplay designer, you are great at the second to second. You're great at working. You are more of an artist. You're working with the animators. It's visual fidelity. You have to understand that your job is to make sure that the animation fidelity and how smooth the camera is and all that is working perfectly, and that is more of an artistic slant. Well, if you're a systems designer, it's all about it's a lot to do with systems and statistics and balance between numbers, and it's much more math focused. So it's the kinds of people you want to hire for one are going to be a lot different than what you hire for the other one.
So can you say that a gameplay designer is like a director of a little piece of a game?
Yeah, like a gameplay designer might be responsible for the shooting in a game or the camera part of the game, or sometimes both, the camera and the shooting and second to second.
I see. Thank you.
Hello, one more question, please. You were saying about humility and that you often find solutions in maybe somebody else's ideas to a specific problem. And I was wondering if you take this to an extreme, doesn't that become a problem that, for instance, you source ideas from many different people, and ultimately it comes like to a conglomerate of ideas that don't gel together because they don't follow like a certain vision. The product has like many great ideas on a on a very small level, but overall they're not united by any kind of theme or maybe like one governing idea that makes it, you know, consistent throughout the experience.
So no, I don't think that's very important. That obviously the ideas all gel and that they fit the themes and are consistent. And as your job as a designer, when I say your job as a designer is to find the best idea, I mean your job is to find the best idea that is consistent and fits the themes and everything else. So it's just that you might get that idea or inspiration from someone that's not yourself. It's still your job to make sure that all those ideas are brought together and that they fit, because you have a lot more knowledge on what the restraints of whatever you're working on is, you know, the schedule, the tools that you have, the people that you're going to work with. You have all that knowledge, but there might be someone else who has an idea that inspires you that you're like, holy, I should go with her idea instead of mine because it's going to work so much better. I guess it's more, when I say ideas, I mean inspiration, though sometimes it's a fully baked idea depending upon where it's coming from. But yeah, those aspects are still very important to making sure the ideas work within the context of the game.
Okay, so as I understand, you should have the humility to listen to others, but ultimately it's okay to pull rank in the end and say, okay, this is the direction we're going for.
Oh yeah, no, if you have a team that's working well, then everyone understands what they're responsible for. And if you have managers who are doing a good job as managers, they're letting their people make those decisions. So if you're responsible for a level, it's your job to make the call on how that level needs to be put together and what ideas are going to be used. So yeah, design by committee is terrible. Brainstorming is something that I think gets thrown out there as this wonderful solution to everything. In fact, I find brainstorming is good for generating a whole bunch of ideas, but it's one person going away and then taking all that and coming up with the actual plan that works. The group never comes up with the plan together. It's always, or usually, one person.
Okay, thank you very much.
So, hello again.
Yeah.
I assume you don't only hire experienced designers. So you sometimes hire people like, let's say, off the street, like, you know, no experience, no portfolio, and so on. What are like the core qualities you seek in such case?
Well, there's so it depends. Some of the places we go to in the Austin studio, just a few hours north in Dallas, there is a university called the Southern Methodist University that actually has a game development program, and we often send designers up there to give talks and to meet up with the designers, and we get a lot of talent from that location. In Edmonton, the studio has a good relationship with the University of Alberta, where again we will target students who perhaps have a programming background or a writing background, depending upon what we're looking for. So it's often a lot of our new recruits come from our relationships with schools that are close to the studio that we're going to hire into.
Okay, but in terms of personality traits, anything comes to mind?
It is humility is a big one. So that's and I think just someone who we always look for someone who goes above and beyond the expectations. So, you know, when you're looking at student projects, there's like, if there's 10 students and 8 of them have done what the course told them to do, but then 2 made something that was much more, went above and beyond that. They had obviously a lot of passion for it. We look for passion. Passion's a huge part of it, because if you have someone who's passionate, that will go a long ways.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so one more question, this time going back to the ego and negative behaviors. I have a question. If you have a worker, a designer that displays these negative behaviors, Do you have any techniques other than, of course, telling them to improve? And if maybe you yourself see any of these bad behaviors coming up in your work, do you have any ways to improve and maybe get rid of them, get more humility, basically?
Well, I think obviously one of the best ways, is as a manager just sitting down and talking to someone and not making one of the worst. People become defensive if you make it all about them and it's viewed as more of an attack. But if you talk about their behaviors and how it's impacting the people around them or their ability to do their job, that's often a way to get them to understand why their behavior is not a good one. So I think whenever you're communicating that, you don't want them to shut down. You want them to, so you don't want to be the mean manager who comes in and goes, "You're terrible because of blah, blah, blah," because they're gonna hate you and not want to listen to you. So you have to be careful about that. Another way that we do it is through peer feedback. At Electronic Arts, there's a way for you to actually ask for peer feedback, so you can find out from the people you work anonymously how they feel, how well the job you're doing or how you communicate. So that's a useful way if you just want to go out and do it on your own without any ask from your manager. So that's kind of some of the ways I would say that we communicate that.
Okay, thank you.
We still have time for 2 more questions, so feel free to ask. Someone from downstairs, perhaps? Just raise your hand. Okay.
Hi. About listening to the other's opinion, I want to make sure. Where does the listening to QA fit into the Bioware's process?
So I think listening to QA is something that is very important, and it is again something that's kind of an art. There's not a strict rule to it because it often depends upon the the QA person you're dealing with. When you're dealing with a very experienced tester who knows that actually I shouldn't be worried about this aspect of the game at this stage in production, then you can take their feedback almost 100%. But if it's, say, someone you don't have a relationship with or who's newer in their role, they might be reporting feedback that isn't really useful at the stage of the product you're in. So it's we have at the end of a product, we have something, a product lifecycle, we have a triage process. And the triage process is where, because we're getting, with games this size, you get thousands and thousands of bugs. And what you need to do is you need to essentially prioritize the bugs so that the team is working on the highest priority ones and then the next priority. And so what you do is you have all the leaders of that project sit in a room. It's very exciting, for hours on end, and read every single bug and go, that's priority 1, that's priority 3, that's priority 2, that's priority 1. And this goes on for months and months. It can be soul-crushing. But it's, hey, you get to be the leader of the product. That's one of your responsibilities. So it's, yeah. But yeah, QA's, having a great relationship with your quality assurance team is very important to being successful.
Thank you.
Okay, so I have another question up here.
Oh.
So thank you very much for your speech. And I have a little bit more of a production question. Design deliverables, basically. I mean, do you have any tips or tricks how to manage that? Because design, in many cases, especially for example, system designs, tend to, be ready when they're ready, and it's you could try time boxing them, of course, but that can always lead you nowhere. So, do you have any, tricks for that?
Well, I think one of the things is you want to get a version done as quickly as possible to have feedback given on it, but you just want to make sure that the right people are involved at the feedback stage that you're doing. So if it's the very first iteration of a system, you want experienced people designers and thinkers within that team who can give feedback on a system that is a first iteration with a terrible interface and with placeholder VFX, all that, right? Like you need to essentially you need to get to a feedback stage as soon as possible and make sure you have the right people giving feedback, and then you expand that as you get more and more finished until obviously you have a system that you can now give to QA, and you can get feedback from, or you can do a beta test and get feedback from the public at the opposite side of the process.
All right, thank you.
Thank you very much. Mr. James Ohlen, let's give him a big applause. Thank you very much.